Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing Greenbelt, which is the Christian festival that's based in Cheltenham, which took place last weekend. Sadly, Greenbelt are taking a very anti-Israel position in which they're swallowing much of the lies and the propaganda put out by the Palestinian PR machine that's aimed to delegitimize the State of Israel. Welcome to the Middle East Report. To discuss Greenbelt, I'm joined by Pastor Mike Fryer from Christians for Zion. Mike, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report. And firstly, I want to say thank you for the wonderful stand you're making on behalf of Israel, particularly what's happening at Greenbelt. For our viewers who are very familiar with you, because I know that quite a few years ago you were regularly on Revelation TV, but can you share with us a little bit about your background, how you became a believer, and also how you became such a passionate advocate of Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, I became a believer 18 years ago as a police detective. So I'm interested in justice and truth and all those things that you associate with the police work. And when I began to read the Bible and look at the prophecies concerning Israel, I realized that Israel has a big place in God's heart, and his plan for the future is connected to Israel. And that for me is the foundation of the reason for what I do with regard to Israel. And I first went there in 1967, but I didn't go back there until 2003. And during those times, there were suicide bombings. There were bombings in hotels, in restaurants, and on buses. And I got involved with the people and realized that actually they were just people like you and I who were trying to live in peace with this constant threat of terror upon them. So that's really why I am doing what I'm doing today. So thanks for inviting me, Simon.
Nice, it's a pleasure. But also, you attended the Yad Vashem Holocaust Studies course. It's organised by the Christian Friends of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. What were your experiences of being in Jerusalem at the Holocaust Museum, and what did you learn from that course? Well,
I did a 4-year course, which was before the Christian desk was opened in Yad Vashem, and the things that I did was to study the history of the church, to study the time leading up to the Holocaust, and what that course did for me was give me an understanding for two things. Firstly, that the Jews were dehumanized, because if you dehumanize a people group or a nation or individuals, you're able to kill them. I experienced that in the police force where I dealt with murders and was part of murder investigations. If the victim was dehumanized by the perpetrator, it made it much easier to kill them. And that's what I realized had happened before the Holocaust. And the evidence is that the church played a role in that. And historians like Stephen Haynes and many other historians would say that without Christendom, the Holocaust couldn't have taken place, because we played a big role in dehumanizing the Jew in the last 1700 years, and even up to in 1933, when publications were made by church leaders in their magazines to say the Jews were pigs and they had no right to live in Europe, and they were the problems for European social decay. So that was the first thing. And secondly, the thing I learned was that there are 4 groups in any genocide, including Holocaust. And those groups are, the first one are the victims, which clearly were the Jews, and also homosexuals and Freemasons and Serbs and Gypsies. Then there were the perpetrators, who were clearly the Nazi Party and those associated with the Nazi Party. And then we have the bystanders, who were those who stood by and did nothing, and of course the rescuers, and I guess we all know Schindler being probably one of the most famous rescuers. But what I realized is that the church became probably the biggest bystander, because 95% of Germany were Christian. And we stood by and allowed that. Now, I'm not judging the people there, because they could have been arrested and their whole families would have been executed had they been caught helping Jews. But the fact remains that they stayed silent in the years preceding the war, and when anti-Semitic remarks were made by their clergy and their leaders, they sat back and did nothing. And that's given me an understanding of the place we need to be, in the sense of we need to be a voice and be outspoken, and we all need to help, because it's the lives of people that we're talking about, and their rights to have a nation of their own. So.
No, I couldn't agree more with you, and certainly looking back at that period of history, there was so much silence, really, and so much even support for the kind of Nazi party, despite the fact that Hitler had written Mein Kampf, despite the fact the Jewish community were being targeted with the Nuremberg race laws and everything else. The church on a whole kind of embraced the whole Nazi movement. So this is obviously something that we can learn from today, is that the Jewish people are his precious people, and it's our duty to stand up for them and to speak on their behalf. And that's exactly what you're doing in your opposition to Greenbelt. Now, can you share with our viewers what the Greenbelt Festival is and why they're taking an anti-Israel position?
Well, that's a big question. But Greenbelt began as an evangelical Christian movement. And I've spoken to people who were there right in the beginning, you know, kind of people who are now in their 50s, who tell me that was absolutely a fantastic festival. It engaged young people with the contemporary methods of providing the gospel to the world through music and art and all those things. And it focused solely on the gospel message. And that was the thrust of Greenbelt. But in the last 3 or 4 years, certainly Greenbelt has changed. The music is still there. Certainly the music is a central point of Greenbelt. But the thrust and the messages have changed. And in the last 3 years, the message has become very political and very anti-Israel. And speakers like Claire Short have spoken at Greenbelt, who is a politician who has a very anti-Israel stance and a worrying stance with regard to the nation of Israel. And in these last 3 years, they've kind of continued with that message to such an extent that they've refined it and empowered it to teach basically hatred to a wide range of Christians who would attend.
And we've got a clip to go to now that looks at the Christian festival known as Greenbelt, and this year was their 40th anniversary. Just gives you a kind of feel of Greenbelt as a festival.
Stand the old-fashioned language, and what we wanted was a language that was relevant. More than anything else, we wanted to be relevant in the world.
James, who had this vision that if the Christians all went into the field and all used the same toilet, so to speak, they'd get on with their lives and sort out the important things.
I remember the year of the Witch and the Willies, and that was extraordinary. It was outrageous.
Both those things together rather made it difficult for Greenbelt on a PR level.
Controversy has dogged the festival.
Some of the leadership from where I am from wouldn't allow us to take groups of young people to Greenbelt.
We lost thousands of people, and we lost thousands of pounds as well in 1 year.
We actually took a vote for the festival to close.
I think what happened to Odell, though we loved it there, we just got too big for it. So we looked and we moved to Nebworth. And we were quite excited because we were going to put the stage roughly where the Rolling Stones stage had been.
Some Irish guy says he wants to come to the festival tomorrow, and it turned out to be The Edge.
Once the move to Cheltenham had been made, then the Angel community made absolute sense.
This year Greenbelt's 40. The most interesting bit is maybe the next 40.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Mike, we saw that clip on there that gives us an understanding of what Greenbelt is for those of us who haven't been like myself. I've never been to Greenbelt. I've heard of Greenbelt, but never actually been. But what are your major concerns and grievances concerning Greenbelt, and certainly regarding the position they're taking on Israel, that has caused you to rally 100 Christians in protest at what they're doing?
Greenbelt have an agenda which is not a Christian agenda. That's the main reason. And that agenda is being forced forward by people, leaders within the Christian community, who again don't have a Christian agenda or a biblical agenda for Israel. And Greenbelt has become the platform for much of that anti-Israel rhetoric. One of their phrases is, "We're here for social justice." Well, I think more importantly, we need to be here for truth and justice. That's the key. We need to be people of truth and we need to be people of justice. And their platform of social justice, or their idea of social justice for the Palestinians, is removing the rights of the Jews for justice. And there is no middle ground for them. They don't want to hear about the stories of the Jews who've been killed throughout the last 60 or 70 years through suicide bombings, attacks by Arabs, the states around them attacking them. They don't want to hear that story at all. They don't want to hear that the wall, the security fence, is a fence to defend Jewish people from suicide bombers. They literally don't want to hear the other side of it. And that was why on Sunday we went with about 120 Christians to ask them to hear the other side of the story.
And also, I think you've approached the organisers as well by trying to get a pro-Israel speaker, haven't you? And they've also declined of that.
That's right. I was aware that they had declined a speaker from the Council of Christian and Jews and other offers of a speaker. And I think it's important that we have two sides to a story when you've got a huge number of people at Greenbelt, maybe between 15 and 20,000 attending there, that everybody has a balanced view. When I spoke to Paul Northup and his assistant Abby on Sunday, they said, and quite rightly, they were right in their statement saying, we have a right to choose our own speakers. But actually, they're right in that, but they have a responsibility to teach truth. They don't have a right to misinform. And that's another aspect of this festival, which is worrying. It's misinformation. Nobody has the right to give it misinformation about a people group and cause Christians within the UK to begin to hate a country like Israel.
And we've got a clip to go to now. It's entitled "The Forgotten People," and the issue of Israel and the Palestinians has almost become a central theme of the Festival of Greenbelt.
Hello, my name is Sui Ang, Dr. Sui Ang. I'm a medical doctor. Now, if you look at me, I'm just a Chinese-looking woman, and you don't want to hear about Palestine from me, but I want you to see beyond all this and look away from me and hear what I've got to say about 28 years of my experience with these people, and that will completely change your stereotypic view about them. I met Palestinians 28 years ago when I worked in the refugee camps, and I discovered they were neither terrorists nor hateful people. They are the most gentle and kind people whom the world has forgotten and wronged. And I hope your generation will be the one that will right this wrong, whom my generation have failed to do.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. We've also got another clip to go to that was taken from a Greenbelt 3 years ago, back in 2010. And this is Christians dressed up as Israeli soldiers and trying to show what it's like for ordinary Palestinians, so-called, living under Israeli occupation. But let's remember, this actually demonizes Israel. This demonizes the Jewish people. The reason why Israel has checkpoints is to stop terrorists like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and also terrorist organizations associated with Fatah, the ruling party, the Palestinian Authority, from carrying out terrorist attacks. And the reason why the security fence is built is to actually protect Israeli citizens from terror. And it's been very, very successful. But look and see how propaganda is used to stir up hatred against Israel and the Jewish people.
This is Rick. This is no good. No good.
It
Go
will
home.
get another one. Go away.
Hey, hey.
Non-Palestinians, keep moving. Palestinians in this queue.
This is a Christian arts festival.
No good.
This is no good.
No good.
Non-Palestinians, 3 go. The checkpoint's closed. The checkpoint's closed to Palestinians. Non-Palestinians, 3 go.
Go away. Go away.
Palestinians, line up there.
This is the reality. This is the reality.
Because Jews were kicked out in, before
The reality
1949.
now.
Of course it is now.
It is. We are there so many times. We've been there time after time, and we see it every time.
But you
Queued
you're giving
for
the wrong
hours.
impression.
We are
You
not,
were
because we have
totally-
been there.
What's wrong?
Just being
Have you seen it? It is awful. They queue from 4 a.m. to get through a checkpoint to get to work for
and
9.
It stops bombs from getting
It
in
does
and
not
killing
stop
people.
nothing.
Yes,
it is
it
not
does.
for security. It's between
It
Palestinian and
It
Palestinian.
stops. You do exactly the same if
Next.
you lived in London.
Not at all. You do not
You
put the
would.
close
We
about
had
it.
cordons around London when
We
the
do
IRA were
not.
bombing, didn't we?
We do not have checkpoints every few miles. You could not move out of Cheltenham for a checkpoint. And it's not
That's a comfortable middle class liberal Christian. This is not Palestine.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. As we see in that clip, it's truly shocking that to think that a Christian festival is organised for 20,000 people that should be about spreading the gospel and the message of God's love, and yet what we're seeing here is the victimisation against Israel and against the Jewish people is becoming a central theme of the Green Belt Festival. We're now joined on the phone by Chrissy, who is a Christian Palestinian, who can give some sort of detail about what life is really like for Christians living under the Palestinian Authority. Hello, Chrissy, and welcome to the Middle East Report.
Hello. Hi, thank you for asking me to be here.
It's a pleasure. But for our viewers, can you share something of your kind of extraordinary background and how you came to be living in the UK, and certainly the great work you're doing, exposing a lot of the lies and misinformation that the Palestinian Authority is putting out?
Yeah, I was back home in Palestine. I was a law student and I was studying about human rights and freedom of speech. But I found out afterwards that this culture and this place lack big time of these rights. And the problem is that my people don't know what these rights are, so they don't know what they're missing. Therefore, my government is taking the advantage of misleading them, lying to them, and misusing them and abusing them, basically.
And Chrissy, I know that you attended the Greenbelt Festival at the weekend. Also know that you spoke to some of the organisers. What are the kind of things that you actually said to the organisers who are so concerned about the plight of the Palestinians?
Yes, the kind of things were that I understood that they were concerned about my people, and that touched my heart. But it wasn't just of them to just present one side of the story and not present the other side, because in each story there are both sides and both the situations and positions which needed to be presented. And as Greenbelt, it wasn't presented, sadly. So that's what I've been asking them, because what they're presenting is actually harming the Christians of Palestine big time, and they're not aware of it. My people, and it's so frustrating that my people has been taken as hostages for the theologies that the churches have been creating and developing. And these churches has been doing these things, thinking that the radicals won't drive them out, and the radical Islam won't drive them out of these places. But they're not aware that in a few years' time they'll be driven out anyway. If you look at the percent of the Christians in Bethlehem, it's up from 85% to 8% now. And they tell you all because of the occupation. That's what they say. But basically, what's really weird, that the number of Muslims is rising at the same time in that area. So if the occupation was the reason, therefore both people should be leaving that place. Why only Christians are leaving it? So there's a clear picture here that the major problems that are the Christians, especially, and the Church of Palestine is facing is due to the radical Islam, and rising of radical Islam in that area.
Yeah, and this is what we see, sadly, by so many supporters like Stephen Sizer and organisations like Sabil and Embrace Middle East. They take such a strong pro-Palestinian position, yet they seem to be so silent when it comes down to the persecutions of Palestinian Christians by organisations like Hamas, and even by Fatah, the ruling authority within the Palestinian Authority.
True. Sadly, this is the position, and it's due to what I would explain the situation is as Stockholm Syndrome. I don't know if you heard about this concept. It's when people, like Sabil institution, they start buying, they are hostages buying into the situation, and they forget that they've been captive and they're not having the rights, so they'd rather buy into the situation and adapt, and instead of facing it, because they'd face death.
Yeah, and also, can you share with us as well, because clearly the suffering of the Palestinians is a horrendous thing, but why is it that Israel singled out, and the likes of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Kuwait, other Middle Eastern countries have a horrendous policy of discrimination, apartheid and oppression against the Palestinians, and yet the world is silent regarding the treatment of these Palestinian people that are in these Arab lands?
Yeah, well, sadly, if you look at the situation here, it is so sad for the Arabic people. My people are being mistreated and killed in that area. Not only Palestinians, in the whole Arab world, people are killing each other. And the problem is that they'd rather put the spotlight on Israel rather than facing their own problem and standing for it and say, well, we are doing mistakes. We're wrong. We should stand and up for it and change it. They'd rather put the blame on Israel each time, and it's the first that says it's basically they should look at the speck in the plank in their eyes instead of looking at the speck in Israel's eyes.
And my final question really is that the fact that the Israeli society and also the Israeli people and the government have done so much for peace, particularly offering Yasser Arafat the Camp David in 2000, a Palestinian state in which they would then be free to govern their own affairs. But we saw that Arafat rejected that and turned to a wave of violence and terrorism in response. And also the fact that the Palestinian Authority, also Hamas, are teaching Palestinian children to hate through their media and education system. Now, surely peace will only really work if it comes from the ground up rather than the top down. And so why, for example, do these groups not mention the hatred and incitement and the radicalization of young Palestinians through the Palestinian media and education system today?
Yes, again, because they don't want to look at it. Sadly, as you mentioned, the situation with Yasser Arafat. Well, all my people almost loved him when he was alive, but sadly they didn't know them. They weren't aware that he refused the peace agreement for the reasons of pride and money, sadly. I'm really frustrated and devastated to say that, but that this is the case. Hamas is using education and media and even the UNRWA. They're using the UNRWA schools and places to incite hatred in the education as well. There's lots of hatred. And the Christian organizations like Sabil and other Christians, they are not putting the light on these things because, again, it's a matter of death and life. They're not admitting that actually Israel, the Hamas is inciting hatred because it's a matter of death and life for them. They'd rather not face it. They're so frightened to stand up for it.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Chrissy. And we had to conceal your identity for your own personal safety. So thank you for your courage and thank you for your bravery and thank you for prepared to speak the truth despite the personal cost to you personally.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. A very brave girl. Obviously, Chrissy's not a real name. She has that name just to kind of protect herself, but she's willing to really stand against the lies and the propaganda. And I suppose this is the thing that concerns me the most, Mike, is the fact that they buy into the Palestinian propaganda and lies, and yet do nothing about or say anything about the suicide bombings against Israel. They say nothing about the rockets and missiles that fall upon Israeli towns and cities, as we saw last November. They say nothing about the hatred and the incitement to hatred through the Palestinian education system and their media, and also they don't also state Israel's right to exist. It's a completely anti-Israel position, which, in my opinion, is completely ungodly.
Well, it is ungodly, but it's also unjust, and I think that's the point of Chrissy's presentation. There are injustices taking place for Palestinian Arab Christians and for anybody who supports Israel. I don't know whether you're aware, but Stephen Curry's church in East Jerusalem, which is a Christian church that supports the Old Testament and the prophecies for Israel, that was torched this last week in East Jerusalem. Now, that's not freedom. And I want to go back to the clip from the first clip that you gave with the Chinese doctor, the lady who said that the Palestinians are a lovely, gentle people. I've met many. She is absolutely right. And that's another reason why I want to see the truth coming out, because between 1967 and 2000, when Israel governed the Palestinian people in Israel, the quality and the standard of living was far higher than it ever was before under Egyptian rule or after under Jordanian rule. I'm sorry, and under Egypt's rule in Gaza. They had a far better standard of living, and under Hamas today, Palestinian Arabs are suffering. They can't speak out. They can't talk about it. Their Israeli friends, who they had a close relationship before. In 2005, the Gush Katif community are an example of that, who were evacuated in 2005 from their homes in Gaza. 8,500 Israeli civilians taken from their homes for the promise of peace by Arafat and his authorities. And yet they didn't have peace at all. They left their friends in Gaza who have since been persecuted. You've seen the pictures, surely, of the executions of those who have collaborated with Israel in Gaza. The summary executions and the bodies being dragged behind motorcycles because they've rang a friend in Israel. Is that freedom? Is Sabil and Greenbelt and those who are involved in those organizations, Embrace Middle East, speaking for freedom? No, they're sowing into and preparing for a state which will oppress women, which will abuse children, and also a state which will be so fueled up to destroy every Jew in the Middle East, which is what Hamas and the PA have said. So it is an emotive issue, and Christy is speaking in terms of what is the church going to do for the Palestinian Christians. We have to get behind an Israeli state for freedoms for the Palestinian Christians, because they were free before 2000, before Arafat. And we have to release the money that Arafat stole. He divested $560 million of aid money going from Europe into his own bank accounts that didn't reach the Palestinian people. Those really nice people who we should be fighting for. Embrace should be fighting for those. Sabeel should be fighting for those. Stephen Sizer should be fighting for those people, because they are, people like you and I who deserve freedoms. They're not going to get it under a Palestinian Arab regime. That's been proved historically. They'll only get that living under the governance of Israel. So, Chrissy, I just want to bless you for what you said, and because it is the truth.
Absolutely. We've got another clip to go to now, and this is a personal diary taken from Greenbelt 2010, part of the Justice Camp.
All throughout the Greenbelt camp, they have these placards with trivia tips about in Gaza. Greenbelt was Gaza. Half the day there would be no power for music or talks. Again, this is from the Just Peace group. Okay, this is the Just Peace booth that Wesley was talking about. Panning over here, this is a wall that they built to represent, the wall is 8 meters high. It's the same height as the wall in Palestine that the Israelis built. Just to give you an idea of what the Palestinians are going through. Here's another of the placards. If Greenbelt was Gaza. Sorry, no exit. And you might be wondering what that means. In 2007, Israel imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip, making it impossible for residents to leave and near impossible for anyone to enter. And this morning, on the main walkway, they had a reenactment of 2 Palestinian women who were trying to leave, and they had 2 soldiers there telling them that they were not allowed to leave, even though they had the proper papers. And this is something that has been going on since 2007. Farmers can't get to their land to work it. Families can't get to other family members. And this is something that Just Peace is working to change. And there are some details for more information. Greenbelt was Gaza. 14,700 of us would be refugees. And there's just a queue of people waiting to get into the children's area, just to give you an idea of how many people are here. I'm looking at all these people. Pretty much all of them would be refugees if we were in Gaza. Here again is a picture of a lot of the tents where the majority of people are living this weekend.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. That clip should make you angry, because it makes me extremely angry. The fact that Israel had to build a security fence in the first place was because of the wave of suicide bombers that were attacking Israel. They were attacking schools, they were attacking cafes, restaurants, buses, in the most horrendous and despicable manner. The fact now that Israel has this security fence means that Israel faces no threat of suicide bombings at all, which has done more to actually create peace between the two sides, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Mike, I'm just disgusted really with that propaganda, and actually fact of trying to build the so-called wall at a Christian festival that's purely designed to just demonize Israel and the Jewish people, and I'm sick and tired of this, to be honest. That's my personal thing.
This is despicable propaganda, really, because if Greenbelt was Gaza, then the people of Greenbelt wouldn't be able to grow their hair. Men would have to have their hair cut. In the last 2 months, 8 young men who have had long hair have been taken off the streets in Gaza, taken to a police station and had their head shaved just because they got long hair. They're not allowed to wear certain types of clothing. If Greenbelt was Gaza, then all the children we saw at Greenbelt would have been taken to the summer camps run by Hamas, which teach 100,000 children aged between 12 and 16 to fire guns and rockets and carry suicide belts into Israeli homes and into their restaurants, etc. If Greenbelt was Gaza, women would not have the freedoms that they have in Greenbelt today. What's going on here in Greenbelt? They've got it wrong, and that's the frustration. And also that with the issue with the wall, I interviewed in their hospital beds people who had been bombed in Maxim's restaurant in 2005, and they were devastated by the extent of the bombing, where 50-odd people had been injured, 23 killed, simply because there was no security. And now we've got security. The Greenbelt and its supporters are saying that Israel doesn't need security or doesn't have the right to defend their citizens. That statement is anti-Semitic. Because if you afford rights to other nations that you don't afford to Israel, that one nation, then that statement has to be anti-Semitic. So I'm sorry, I'm a bit emotive, Simon, but I know the facts on the ground because I've been there and I know what's happening in Gaza. It's really sad. Human rights are not being upheld in Gaza, and Greenbelt are upholding that situation.
And for my own personal thing, I had a friend who was killed in a terrorist attack in Israel back in 2002. I've also been to areas that have been devastated by kind of suicide bombings, and to say that Israel's not allowed no security against a terrorist organisation that's not only committed to Israel's destruction, but also in their covenant charter calls for the destruction of the State of Israel. Now, Greenbelt have put out a statement. This is Greenbelt Festival have put out a statement on the Israel-Palestinian programming, Greenbelt, and this is what they state. Greenbelt attempts to make links with people in situations around the world struggling for justice and peace and give them a stage. We view this as part of our mission. In addition, in terms of our programming on highlighting issues around Israel-Palestine, Greenbelt also aligns itself with the resolutions of international law drawn up by the United Nations that deems the continued Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories as illegal, the separation wall being built since 2002 as illegal, and the continued building of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank as illegal. So, I mean, looking at that statement, firstly, it's down to the two sides between the Israelis and the Palestinians as part of the Oslo Accords to come to their own final conclusion, their own peace treaty in terms of, this is why we've got the final status issue to deal with the status of Jerusalem and the so-called refugee problem. But also to say that the separation wall, which was built purely as a defensive measure, and then thirdly, that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal, which is the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. And not only that, is that they want this to be Judean-free, and yet Israel has a population, 10% of Israel's population are Arab.
Yeah. Can I focus on this issue regarding refugees? Because that's what Greenbelt focus on. Since 1948, 796,000 Palestinian Arab refugees were created on the day of independence or thereafter, because their Arab governments told the Palestinian Arabs living in Israel to get out of the land, because they were going to blow Israel out of the sea, basically out of the district. At the same time, and this is what Greenbelt don't mention, and this is the imbalance of it all, 856,000 Jewish refugees were created by Arab lands when these Jews were thrown out of their lands and property which they'd lived in for 1,000 years. And that
More
land
than
and
1,000
property
years goes back to
equaling
to
4
Babylon.
times the size of Israel.
Yeah.
And there was a bigger Jewish refugee problem than there was a Palestinian Arab problem. Now, the world, and quite rightly, have thrown money and after money at the Palestinian Arab refugee problem to help those people. No money has been given to the Jewish refugees. The money that's been sent to the Palestinian Arab refugees has not got through. And today we can't really call them refugees. They've been there for 50 years. They are being used as a tool by the Palestinian Arabs, and clearly now many within the leadership in Christendom, as a tool to destroy the nation of Israel. All these references, occupation, refugees, are not balanced with truth and fact. And I think we really need to stop using this terminology. We shouldn't use Palestinian Arab refugees. They're not. They're living in houses. And if you look at Gaza and the Palestinian Authority areas, if you go to Ramallah or Jenin, or in places in Gaza, some of these houses are luxurious. I would love to live in some of those places with the swimming pools in. There's not a refugee issue here. And there's not an issue of occupation. It's an issue of terrorists living in the region who have an agenda to destroy Israel and using every tool possible, including their own people.
Yeah, which is sadly, this is probably the crux of the problem, particularly with the Palestinians, is the failed leadership that they have, and also the failure of the world to recognise what's really going on, and that is the oppression of Palestinians living in Arab lands, which they're very much silent on. But one thing that does concern me so much with Greenbelt is this theological shift that we're seeing, this embracing the social gospel, but not only is embracing the social gospel, but also embracing this new term of Christian Palestinianism, which is now developing and emerging as the new liberation theology. And really, at the heart of this is church replacement theology, isn't it?
Absolutely. Their leaders teach that Jesus was a Palestinian. You see the Christmas cards and the Christmas carols talking about Mary and Joseph being Palestinians. They were Jews. I've heard one leader in the anti-Israel charitable status organizations saying that Jesus was a Semite from an Oriental religion. What's that about? It's got to be the Palestinization of Jesus and the Palestinian Arabs, with an agenda to take away the Jewishness of our faith, because we're rooted, we're grafted into Israel. And this story of replacement theology that's been around for 1,800 years has caused Christendom to be the most aggressive force against Israel. And you think we'd have learned from history? Have we learned from history? It doesn't appear so. Because replacement theology enables one to persecute the Jewish people, because we say we have nothing to do with them, therefore there's a separation. And actually, that is the beginning of dehumanizing the Jews and Israel, and that will cause this hatred to grow. Therefore, it's more insidious than we see it on the surface. It's really dangerous. And we need to learn from our history, and we need to look at the scriptures again and read what God's heart is for Israel. God says in Ezekiel 36, he says, I'm gathering the Jews back to the land to give glory to my name. Why can't we praise God for that today? Why can't Jeremy Moody, Stephen Sizer, Paul Northup, and all those at Greenbelt say, yeah, it's glory to God. You know, that God's promises are being fulfilled in our lifetime. And let's help the Palestinians by giving them a government which is going to give them democracy and give them prosperity and wealth, instead of enforcing them to have a government which is basically a terrorist organization. We've got to change. We've got to do something. And I just want to ask your viewers to get on board with this and be a voice in this time.
Yeah, we got another clip to go to, and this is something you won't hear at Greenbelt, what Hamas is actually like in their control of the Gaza Strip.
10 facts about Hamas. The Hamas is a Palestinian Islamic organization founded in 1987 in Gaza as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. The Hamas Charter explicitly calls for the obliteration of Israel. The Charter repeats medieval and Nazi anti-Semitic rhetoric accusing Jews of controlling the world media and of causing all the world's past wars and revolutions. Hamas is responsible for 40% of suicide terror attacks in Israel, which resulted in hundreds of civilian casualties. In June 2007, Hamas seized control over the Gaza Strip and began imposing an extremist religious rule. Hamas government is responsible for extrajudicial executions of all opposition, persecution of journalists, and shutting down human rights organizations. Hamas persecutes Gaza's Christians. Between the years 2007 and 2011, the Christian population in Gaza has dropped by 45%. Between 2001 and 2012, Hamas has fired 12,000 rockets into Israel, more than 9,000 of them after Israel withdrew completely from Gaza in 2005, and evacuated thousands of Israeli families in the hopes of achieving peace. Hamas war tactics include placing ammunition and rocket launchers in hospitals and mosques and near schools, in violation of the Geneva Convention. Hamas is supported by Iran, from which it receives an estimated $300 million per year, military training, and rockets which are fired into Israel's civilian towns. The United States, the European Union, Canada, and Japan all classify Hamas as a terrorist organization.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and we got one more clip to go to from Greenbelt. I think it's important that we just show some of the propaganda and lies they are teaching 20,000 Christians, and why those who have a heart and a love and a passion for Israel should be very concerned and very alarmed.
Okay, I'm in front of the Just Peace booth, and sorry, what was your name?
Wesley.
Wesley is going to just give a short explanation about what Just Peace is.
So it was nearly 2 years ago now when a group of us from Greenbelt went to the West Bank with the Amos Trust, and we were staying in Bethlehem. We went to Jerusalem, to Hebron, and we met a lot of Palestinians, Israelis, Muslims who were working out there, and it really moved us all so much, like the shocking injustice of the whole situation, the oppression of the Palestinian people, that we felt that Greenbelt really had to take a stance on this, and Greenbelt had to stand up and make its voice heard amongst the others. And so that's what the Just Peace campaign is trying to do, trying to raise awareness of the conflict in Israel-Palestine. We got a huge program of speakers, really great program of speakers throughout the weekend, and hopefully we'll be able to get people talking, get people thinking, and hopefully get people acting. We'll be talking, the culmination of this weekend will be when we're having a discussion on the boycott, whether or not it's right to boycott Israel and Israeli goods. And hopefully that will then lead into a decision that the trustees may make on whether Greenbelt should take the official stance to boycott Israeli goods, which would be a huge thing. And that is something that, from my experience, seems to be something that we as a Western country, a big supporter of Israel, can do to make our sort of our voice heard and help the Palestinian people use our economic power to do that. So yeah, there's a great range of stuff on, and hopefully a lot of people can learn.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. There we saw in that clip a young Christian calling for boycott against Israeli goods. You know, what does the world come to? That's all I can say. Mike, again, here we go. Boycott, the Greenbelt are boycotting Israeli goods and produce produced in Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel. They're encouraging young people to take up this cause against Israel. Yeah. And all I can say is, how can God bless them? If it says in his word, I will bless those who bless Israel, and I will curse those who curse Israel, because surely they're cursing the God of Israel and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Of course they are, and they're cursing what God is doing in that land. He's starting to bless the land now. It's prospering. It's growing fruit and vegetables for the rest of the world, and we're all enjoying it. And it's also providing all the IT equipment that you have here, and you have in your homes, the computers, etc. And to call for a boycott is economically damaging for the Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs that work in Israeli industry earn 3 times more than they would if they worked for their own people. That's the story. Palestinian Arabs are being employed by Jews because they work very well together. They have different skills. Palestinian Arabs would prefer, those that I've met, would prefer to work for Israeli companies because they get equality, they get fair play. There are, and this is little known, but there are Palestinian Arabs from Gaza living in Sderot because they don't want to live in Gaza, because they don't get a fair crack of the whip. And the BDS movement is again another agenda which brings falsehoods, untruths, so that Israel would be damaged through propaganda in our supermarkets and in our universities.
And Mike, we're less than 3 minutes of the programme, so it's gone very, very fast. Now, we've got to thank a lot of our viewers, and I want to thank you, all of those who wrote to me concerning this issue, to do a programme on it. So I'm doing a programme on it now. But what would you say? I mean, it's incredible that you got 100 Christians willing to stand with you outside the Cheltenham Racecourse at the weekend, which is incredible. But how can we encourage more Christians to make a stand? And why is this issue so important and close to God's heart? This is something that we should really get involved in and actually take action and get ourselves involved.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who emailed me as well as you, but also emailed Greenbelt with their concern, because we had about 120 people standing outside Greenbelt's main entrance, but they were just a fraction of the people who emailed and said they couldn't go for one reason or another. And many of the Bible-based Christians many of them are elderly and not able to get there. But I want to thank you all for all that you did to give a voice, because Greenbelt have now recognized and have said they recognize there is a voice from the biblical-based pro-Israel community. So that's a good thing. What we need to do is to join with networks and organizations that are supporting biblical truths and Israel. There's many out there, CFI and Bridges and all these organizations. So,
Mike, thank you very much for being my guest on the Middle East Report. Sadly comes the end of the program, so keep up the good work you're doing.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching today's program. I believe that we should be very concerned, because we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism throughout Europe, and also in Britain once again. We're seeing a delegitimization of the Jewish state. But now we're seeing an emergence of a new theology emerge within Christian circles, and which is anti-Semitic. Is very hard. It's time to wake up, and it's time to condemn such actions in the name of Christ. So we're going to leave you with this song, which is a little bit more upbeat, which celebrates the nation of Israel and how we should all be proud to wave the Jewish flag of Israel. And thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
כבר ספרו לה ללא יד שמלטפת, רק בחושך מרחפת מול הרוע והשקר, מקמגמת, מתחמקת, מבקשת, מהססת, מקווה ומחפשת את ניצוץ האור ולעצמה לחזור. עוד יום ועוד מכה, שותקת ומחכה, תראו שיום עוד יגיע, שחר יפציע, ידו תוחזת, דגל כחול, כבר צועקת, די כבר לשקר, ידו תוחזת, דגל כחול לבן, כחול לבן, כחול לבן, כחול לבן. הדגל שם גבוה, ישתף לו כל הרוע, מפינה קטנה בודדת, שוב יאיר פתאום הצדק, מהשפל והסבל, הצביעות וגם האבל, תעלה שוב מחוזקת, לא נשברת נאבקת, על ניצוץ האור ולעצמה לחזור הקול שבליבה עוד שר את התקווה תראו שיום עוד יגיע שחר יפציע ידו דוחזת דגל כחול לבן צועקת די כבר לשקר ידו דוחזת דגל כחול לבן כחול לבן כחול לבן כחול לבן או 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 או